I am joined by my co-hosts, Sophie and Nava and countless other spirits. We have today our guest. I'm just gonna like go right into it so we can contextualize what we're gonna talk about right now. We have Tyler Henry, a medium, who you may or may not be aware of, but first, we're gonna tell a couple of spooky stories. Nava, I really want to hear yours.
I don't know if it's spooky, but just as context, I think when you have mice in your home, it sounds like feet.
Okay, wait a second. No,
spooky in what
we're talking
way?
about ghosts.
No,
Okay?
I'm gonna get there as quickly as
Aliens,
possible.
at least.
I had mice in my studio in New York City, and it would sound like footsteps, like humans walking in the house. And I didn't realize that mice could sound like that. That's the context. But I've never seen a mouse where I currently live in LA. Anyway, so one night I had my dachshund Oliver, my dad's dachshund. He barks anytime a person comes, like walks outside the home. You just like lose his mind, whether or not it's the middle of the night or 2 p.m. So one night in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps in my apartment. I was like positive that someone had entered the apartment. I got really scared, but Oliver was sleeping. And I was just like, I just don't think there's any way that if someone had broken in, he wouldn't have lost his mind, because he loses his mind if anyone walks by. But then as soon as I woke up, Oliver woke up, ran into the living room and started barking. And he was just staring at one spot, and he was barking. And I couldn't see anything, but it was like where I had heard the footsteps. And I don't know if it was a ghost, but it's the closest I've ever come to feeling like there might be ghosts. That's my spooky story. What's yours, Penn?
I'm going to build it up, but it's much less of a payoff. I was swimming at midnight near the beach in a pool of a home that I'd rented. Okay. There's no lights on. I jump in the pool, and I was really excited to just sort of vibe and swim. And I realized upon jumping in this pool at midnight in the dark that I was kind of afraid of being in water by myself in the dark. And I thought, I am 37 years old, and I'm having the most irrational fear. Like, not even of sharks, not even of like jellyfish.
You're in a pool.
I'm in a pool. I'm in a pool. And you know what I flashed to? An episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark, where these invisible people would drown kids in a high school pool.
Oh my gosh.
So
the spookiest thing that's ever happened to celebrity Penn Badgley is having access to a pool at night to swim in.
Yeah. Luxury,
exactly.
in a luxury home.
Yeah. I was like, can you believe they don't have lights on? Is there not a shallow end in this pool?
I am blessed and highly favored by the spirit world, and I've never had a spooky experience. So maybe you guys need to get more like me.
Yeah. Sophie does have ghost visitations, but they're all friendly. They're all telling her how well she's doing.
Yeah. They're all
They're not ghosts. They're just people who have died and are continuing on.
They're like, Sophie, we miss you. We want you on the other side, but hang out here a little bit longer. Yeah,
we get it, girl.
Okay.
They evidently don't care if you're naked or not. That's a little Easter egg for people who, for real ones, A1s, day ones.
Yeah.
Back in our, who knows what episode that is. Okay, so today we have renowned medium and author Tyler Henry, best known for his series Hollywood Medium with Tyler Henry, but he can be seen on his show After That, Life After Death, which explores our preconceived notions about death and offers clarity and closure from the beyond through the lens of his own family's past. Most recently, you can see him on Live from the Other Side, which is actually live on Netflix, which I didn't even know you could do. That is more impressive than talking to my dead grandmother, which he also did. No, he didn't. Tyler's journey into mediumship and intuition is really fascinating, and we're excited for you to hear this conversation, so stick around. Don't go dying on us. We'll have to sick Tyler after you, okay? Welcome to Podcrushed. We're your hosts. I'm Penn.
I'm Sophie.
And I'm Nava. And I think we would have been your middle school besties.
Using a Ouija board to find out if our best friend hates us.
Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Give us a snapshot at 12. How were you seeing the world? What was daily life like? School, at home, you know?
Well, at 12 years old, I was about 2 years into understanding that things were very different for me. Everything started for me when I was 10. I had a premonition of my grandmother's death. And this basically just came to me as a knowingness and almost as if it was a memory that hadn't happened yet. And very shortly after telling my mom of this knowingness, we got the news that my grandmother died. So really between the ages of 10 to 13, I was just having these moments happen at school where I spent most of my time. And at 12 years old, I still was trying to kind of understand not only my ability, if I even understood it as such at the time, but who I was as a person. I think we're still forming who we are, between the ages of 10 and 13, and brings in a lot of questions around our identity.
Tyler, prior to the sort of knowing that happened at 10, how would you describe your personality? And was there a shift after you started to have those experiences?
Well, I was born an only child and still am, and I've always very much beaten to my own drum. I've always been kind of isolatory, solitary, very shy. I love people and I love animals. I just generally kind of do my own thing, and really was that way even at 12 years old. I remember hearing a very interesting a piece of expert advice that said, if you look at a first grader, very often you'll see those formative aspects of a person that they carry into adulthood. And I find that to be very true.
Did you have any beliefs or thoughts about the afterlife before 10?
I grew up in a Presbyterian environment, and to be fair, I was more interested in religion even than my parents. I went to several different churches on my own accord, different denominations. Wow. And found it to be very fascinating. I thought that the aspect of community that church provided was really fascinating, and how people kind of connected to this greater sense of unity, transcendence. All of those concepts are very interesting to me. But I had a lot of issues, with certain aspects of it. I didn't understand, heaven and hell in the traditional sense. And even my work today, kind of expands upon those ideas in beyond what that binary seems to provide.
Yeah. Tyler, when you started to have these psychic moments, or I don't know if you refer to them as psychic moments, when you started to have those, for lack of a better word, how did you share that with your peers at school? Were you keeping it a secret? Were you open about it? Were you spooking them?
Well, it was something that for me wasn't really frightening initially, because on some level I didn't know how abnormal it was. But what was scary was people's responses. So I would tell kids at school. I remember I was on a school bus for a field trip, and I looked over at a girl and started telling her about her grandmother who had died, who'd given her a Winnie the Pooh branded, plush. And there were just a lot of really strange moments that, people would hear a message, they didn't understand it. We were all kids. People didn't have the context to be able to even implement that into their spirituality. But you got a whole range of opinions. Some people were very supportive and found it to be very cool. Others were frightened. Others, didn't feel really much of anything.
Is it the story that we've heard is at 10 you sort of revealed this to a teacher of yours. Is that right? In class?
Well, that happened more in freshman year of high school. Okay. So 10 years old was the kind of initial introductory experience. And then by the time I was around 16, by the time I got to my freshman year, I had told many students many things, and ended up actually telling my algebra teacher a message around her former mother-in-law. And it was something with such specificity and detail that I would have had to have been, in their family home to know this information otherwise. And so that was a turning point. I realized at that moment in 9th grade that it was more than just random moments of knowingness, that when applied under a certain way in divine timing and in the goal of helping a person, it could really leave someone better than I found them. And that's what I found to be the case with my teacher.
How did you tell your teacher? Can you sort of paint the picture? Because we've never had a medium on the show before. And we do like to spend a lot of time in early adolescence. So this is just such a unique kind of experience. Like, I want to know the whole thing. How did you approach her? What did you say? How did she respond? Just like paint the scene.
Well, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about mediums generally. And for me, even to this day, I don't see dead people walking around. I very much just kind of get things popping into my head. Sometimes, it'll feel like a song stuck in my head. And on this particular day, as I was sitting in my algebra class and my teacher was kind of pacing the whiteboard, I just kept getting this very strong sense of a name. And it was coming through kind of like when you have an earworm, when you can't get something quite out of your head. And I kept hearing Lorraine, 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 Lorraine. And I didn't know what it meant, but I knew by that point I'd had enough experiences that when things were coming through insistently, if I went with them, if I shared them, usually more information would come through that would follow.
Wow.
So I took this leap of faith after class. I couldn't concentrate for the entire 45 minutes. And I came up to my teacher after everyone left, and I said, Mrs. Camp, I have something to tell you. Ever since I was 10, I've kind of had these weird moments of knowingness around people. I even called it that back then. And I said, sometimes about people who've passed, sometimes it's about people's lives. And she was like, okay, what do you have to tell me? And I was really surprised because this was a very cerebral individual. This is somebody who went on to become, one of the biggest teachers in the United States as far as getting accolades, and she's a mathematician. So she, was very academic. And for her to listen at that time was interesting. But we later found out that was because her mother-in-law, Lorraine, had recently passed away. And as I told her this name that was coming to my mind, tears welled in her eyes, and I started telling her about her former marriage and describing what led to her divorce. And as I said this, my teacher just started crying because Lorraine was her former mother-in-law. My teacher had gotten a divorce from Lorraine's son. And Lorraine was really like the only mother figure she ever had in her life. Her own biological mother was quite cruel and never validated her. And no matter what my teacher accomplished, she never gave her the pat on the back. So when she married into this family, she thought she finally got the mother she never had. And Lorraine came through in that moment to acknowledge that just because it didn't work out with the relationship, that love still existed. And that, for me, was kind of reaching a maturity in my ability. I realized the ripple effect that could have.
So this is interesting because we spend time in this stage of life because, you think about that age. You said you're about 16, but then you first had this inclination, this whatever we'll call it, this development of this capacity at 10. The reason we look at that period of life is because you're developing for the first time all these capacities that are latent in the human being, which you just can't even imagine before childhood, or in childhood rather. And then so afterward, you're really in something of adulthood, and you're a transformed being. So everybody's transforming. Everybody's developing all these, if we're talking about the soul and the spirit and all this stuff, everybody's growing there in that way. You had this additional kind of dimension seemingly open up to you without your volition or without asking for it. So I'm curious, we usually wait a little bit to get into these questions, but I think because we'll end up spending so much time on your mediumship, because it's what you do, I'm really interested in, like, if you're willing to share, like, relationships at that point, like crushes or embarrassing, awkward moments, like the very normal stuff, like like the stuff of coming of age, adolescence, prepubescent, and then pubescent. It's like, because it's so already painfully awkward. I'm imagining if I was to write the film of your life, I would really want there to be a scene, at least one, where, you're just trying to talk to somebody that you are so infatuated with. And then, like, there's a ghost who, sorry, ghost is probably not the right word to use. I know that there's a, they're
going to get you for that.
Or at least your publicist. There's a person
which might be scary,
who's passed on. Yeah, right. Actually, there's a person who's passed on. I think every ghost has more compassion than a publicist, right? Should we say it? No. Oh, it's you know what I mean? Like, I would want you to try. You're talking to somebody and you're just trying to work up the nerve, or maybe they're talking to you because you were too introverted, but you keep getting this message. You know what I mean? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, there were a lot of experiences that were very mundane, very normal, very much a rite of passage. And I think around the ages of 10 to 13, we face so many of those rites of passage. Biologically, we're going through a lot. Emotionally, we're learning who we are. And then relationally, we're kind of getting a sense of orientation around those who, we are involved with. So for me, I had that, but then I also had another layer. And that other layer actually provided more complexity. In some ways, I think it made me have to grow up early. And to give you an example, I had a dear friend who had childhood cancer, brain cancer. And at the time that I was close with him, he had gone into remission. But I had a premonition that my dear friend, as a teenager, was going to get re-diagnosed with cancer and that he would die. And this was somebody I loved deeply. I was quite frankly in love with him as a teenager. But I knew that he wasn't going to live a full life. And I ended up pulling back from him. I couldn't stay in touch with him to the extent that I wanted to, because every time I saw him, it was too painful, knowing that I couldn't prevent what I felt, and just only being able to really focus on his mortality.
Wow.
Shortly before he died, he reached out to me and asked to see me again because it had been a while, and I agreed, and I said, okay, finally, I'd love to see you. And as I did, he passed away within a couple days, and I never got the chance to follow through with that. So, in my own life, I've had regret on how I've handled things. I think if I could do it over, I would have taken that knowingness that he was going to die and would have, if anything, spent more time with him, would have enjoyed what he had to offer, would have cultivated that sense of comfort for him that he needed so desperately. I could have made the end of his life better if I had had the courage to lean in. So that was a lesson.
Does that seem to have had a formative effect on you just in choosing to, because, it seems like maybe thinking of that kind of the purest spiritual impulse, which moves us all into a craft, a profession, whatever it is that part of what made you feel like I have something to offer here and I shouldn't withhold it?
Absolutely. Penn, that's so apt, because for me, it was a time where I felt that, time is of the essence, that there's no time to be wasted here. I saw what happened to my dear friend at 18. And then strangely, as I got around that age, I ended up having a brain cyst. A mass was found at my brainstem shortly, only a few months after my friend had died. And for a while, they weren't sure whether that was a malignant tumor or a benign cyst. And so I found myself at 18 facing perhaps the same fate as the friend I had just watched die. And it ended up being a benign tumor, a benign cyst. And they were able to go in and aspirate it. And ultimately, I was okay. But after that experience, my life changed forever. I got my television show at the age of 19.
Wow.
I came from very humble beginnings, a rural community, and I found that the timing of that illness really corresponded with lighting a fire and allowing me to, I think, step into a greater sense of purpose. So I view it as something that was of a sign.
I'm really curious, Tyler, because the way you described your experience with your algebra teacher, where at first it started with a name that was coming to mind and getting stuck in your head like a song would. I think that everybody has access to some level of intuition, whether they've honed it or not, or developed it. But I'm sure that many people who are listening, myself included, will think of times when they've had experiences like that and just kind of written it off as imagination or meaningless. And I wonder, is there a connection between imagination and intuition? And how do you tell the difference when you're receiving a message?
That's a great question, because I do find that they're very interlinked. For me, I found great value in the teachings of Carl Jung, one of the forefathers of psychotherapy. And his belief is that we really contain multitudes. And I found through this work that there's something about the relationship between the subconscious and divine knowledge. And it's no surprise that there's a relationship between subconscious and creativity. So I think that those very much pull from the same place. And as far as imagination goes, if anything, I've learned things that have came through that seemed like purely imagined ended up landing in a reading in an extremely specific way. So if anything, that binary between, objective and subjective reality became very blurred for me as a person, and it really speaks to the complexities of consciousness.
Before we jump fully into your mediumship, I do, because in our show, we do spend a lot of time in people's adolescence. We're not singling you out. I'm a big fan. I've watched your whole Netflix series, Life After Death. And in that series, you opened up more about some of your family history. If that's not on the table, we don't have to talk about it. But
no, absolutely. I'd love to talk about it.
It seems like your mom in particular went through quite a tragic thing happened to her. I feel like you could tell it in your own words. But I was curious about your relationship with that grandmother figure, who I guess wasn't ultimately your grandmother, and if you ever had any premonitions about her.
Yeah. Well, to kind of put it succinctly, my mom is an extremely incredible human being who faced a very tragic story in her birth. My mom was taken from her biological mother under false pretenses by a woman who went on to kill 2 people and serve 30 years in prison.
That is so
this
wild.
Woman stole my mom for purposes ranging from selling her children to being able to go into whites-only institutions in the 60s in the South. So my mom was raised among Black siblings as the only Caucasian, and her mother used her to basically be able to go into places and read, maps and read street signs, as her mother could not read and write English. So long story short, my mom found out in her 50s that she actually had a loving family that was looking for her whole life. And that she was not indeed related to this monster, this woman who murdered 2 people. And I, in my own life, had only actually seen this woman, her name was Stella, twice. And both times she just stared at me. I remember her eyes were black. More than a color, it was like an essence. And, she never spoke to me. I think she was kind of afraid of me, to be honest. I remember her scurrying around. But that experience brought a lot of conversations around identity, nature versus nurture. My mom and I carried a lot of shame for what we perceived as my grandmother doing, and those old adages of, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and all of these kind of like horrible sayings we have in society where we kind of take on the sins of generations above us, which I think is an important conversation.
In the show, it does talk about some traumatic experiences that your mom and her siblings had at Stella's hands. And I'm just curious, I don't know exactly how to ask this, but like, how did your mom raise you? I mean, I would imagine that she went in the absolute opposite direction, but was there like PTSD, or because that has to have an imprint to suffer abuse at a very young age?
Absolutely. My mom is the most incredible human being I've ever met. I feel so lucky that she's my mother. I would have loved her even if she hadn't have been just for her story. But I will say, I know my mom carries PTSD. I travel with her on tour, and we sometimes share, a hotel room. And there's times where she'll talk in the middle of the night as she's sleeping and express fear and express not feeling safe. And that breaks my heart, to see the long-term effects of that. But I think she wants to use that as a means to educate and hopefully inspire other people that they can make some sense of normalcy of their own lives, despite coming from really abnormal circumstances. One interesting quirk, I will say, that kind of adds a paranormal element to this is Stella basically sent my mom into a mental breakdown when she was around 10 or 12 years old, because Stella was trying to convince my mother that she could see ghosts.
Wow.
Huh.
So Stella kept saying, "Oh, do you see that ghost over there? Do you see that ghost over there?" And my mom wasn't seeing ghosts, but this woman for some reason was trying to just mess with her, and it sent my mom into a complete mental breakdown at a very early age, at a formative age.
Wow.
So when I came on the scene at 10 and was like, "Hey mom, having psychic experiences," you can imagine how
she's like, "Don't
triggering
you fuck
and traumatic.
with me."
Yeah, she's like, that's the last thing we're talking about, right? So in a kind of weird sense, like what got repressed ended up coming out in the next generation, which I just might be a coincidence, but I always thought that was really weird.
Yeah, wow, that is really weird, Tyler. So how did your mom react? How did she feel about it in those early years?
My mom was the first person that I shared the premonition with. I would tell her about things of friends of hers, their personal lives, and my mom knew that I was saying things that someone my age couldn't guess or even kind of deduce. And so I thought that as we grew closer, in some ways, I had to be transparent. And she was very loving, very open, and very supportive. She didn't understand it, but she loved me regardless and put that love first. And I think that was a lesson on being able to appreciate things, despite maybe not understanding them, and that we don't have to understand something to value it.
I'm curious, what are your beliefs about what happens after we die? And of course, your experiences, connecting with spirits in the afterlife would have shaped that. And I'm curious how.
Yeah, of course. It's such a complicated subject innately. I've written 2 books to try to kind of assert different questions that I get in that matter. But generally, when it comes to what I can deduce over the thousands of readings that I've done, it seems that unequivocally there's some continuity of consciousness, that life seems to go on. The second thing I've been able to kind of understand from this is that there seems to be an introspective process by nature. As consciousness transcends and continues, it seems to continue evolving. And as a result, kind of reflecting and growing. And just in the same way that a first grader is kind of limited in their conscious capability and an 8th grader is a little bit perhaps more evolved, we find that we just seem to kind of continue this graduation process. And with that, knowledge and the acquisition of it is just a natural byproduct of expansion.
We're all Baha'is, members of the Baha'i faith. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but
yes, I have. Absolutely.
You have. Okay. So we regularly pray to people who've passed on to the next life. I'm in fact raising my 4-year-old to rather than say die, to say pass on to the next life. We regularly ask family members for help and intercession. So I just, maybe it's important to you or not important to you, but we sort of plainly experience the continuity of life that you're talking about. And I think it's what's interesting to me is that what I yearn for more in our culture is more space to just talk about this and include it as a part of reality, so that it informs the way we behave and the way we treat each other and the way we think about, decision making, the way we think about the career choices we'll make or people we want to be with, all this stuff. I want to hear just how this has affected you growing up, because death, the unknowable mystery of death, and the general cultural consensus that kind of nothing really happens after you die and that's when it ends. It influences the way people behave, and if you don't have that same belief or conviction, and you experience and see the continuity of life after death, it informs the way you behave. How has it affected you growing up?
Well, I will say this. In my life, I've been exposed to a whole range of different beliefs and conversations around belief and what it means to believe. Do we believe in mediums? Do we believe in an afterlife? Do we believe in a higher power? And I've gotten, on some level and on a personal level, bored of those conversations internally, because on some level, I feel like I've gotten to a place beyond belief. Carl Jung has a very famous quote when he was asked about God. Do you believe in God? He said, I know.
I love that.
And that was
love
it.
That one.
And yes, to materialists, that might be a frustrating answer.
Oh, he said materialists. He threw it out. This is a man who belongs on our show.
Right. So on some level, I just kind of accept it for what it is. It's given me a deep appreciation for the people that came before me, a need to learn from previous incarnations of all sorts. It's given me deep value of the present moment and an awareness that what we do right now is really what matters most. And every moment is a new opportunity to create more and be more of oneself. On death, I still look both ways when I cross the street. I've had a number of near-death experiences myself where I've nearly passed. And those were some of the most non-spiritual experiences of my life. They felt like being in an operating room, felt like being a car getting worked on. And so I can recognize that and still grieve. And if I lose or when I lose a loved one, I will still cry. And I will still honor missing and yearning for that physical presence. But with an understanding, one that can't be explained or convinced, that it's just a deep knowingness, a sense of just interconnection.
Tyler, in the Baha'i faith, there's an idea that souls derive their power and their influence from virtue. So sort of like the way that you live your life here has a significant impact on the strength or debility of your soul when you pass, but that whatever state you're in is temporary and you continue to grow, you continue to advance. But sort of like the more you acquire virtues here, the more adept you are with them, the stronger you'll be when you pass. So I think the corollary to that, which I don't think the Baha'i writings say explicitly, but sort of my interpretation is that an evil person here would be quite weak. So I personally don't really believe in evil spirits, but I believe in weak spirits. And I'm just curious what you think about sort of good, evil, how that intersects with your own experiences.
I love that question because I kind of come from a similar place. People have asked me about scary ghosts and scary spirits.
Stop saying ghosts.
I know, right? They're listening. But the thing is we'll talk about evil in a second. Let's just talk about paranormal from the angle of like things that go up in the night or scary things or things that make books fly off the shelves or appear at your bedside. When people come to me and they're frightened, I tell them, maybe we shouldn't demonize this experience. Maybe we should consider what they're trying to tell us. If an animal is cornered, what is it going to do? It's going to lash out, right? It's a cry for help. So I'm more inclined to try to view things that might be initially kind of scary spiritually with empathy, because usually in applying understanding, you can kind of shed light on darkness. Now, when we talk about evil, of course, that's a conversation I myself have had with Stella. With, in some ways being the victim intergenerationally of some seriously evil acts. Even within that context, I'm inclined to believe in acts of evil perpetuated by people who perhaps misunderstand their role here. But I'm less inclined to demonize the essence of the person as much as I'm more inclined to look at the results of what they do. Totally. So more like evil actions, not really sold on evil souls, so to speak.
Do you get a sense of like more buoyancy from certain like people who might have had more virtuous lives than others?
I think that the people that come through the strongest are usually the people who, ironically, were the most connected to their soul while they were still here on some level. So we find that people generally, just this could be coincidence, but artists tend to come through very, very, very clearly, oftentimes more than people who are kind of not expressive or more boundary oriented. In this work, I've had a lot of conversations around boundaries, thin boundaried people, thick boundaried people, how that interrelates to spirituality and creativity. And it does seem that there's some reflection on the other side of people coming through with intensity, who already in life kind of had a sense of interconnection, a lack of boundaries. And they just seem to come through like kind of forces of nature more.
That's
So
really
you mean boundaries
fascinating.
in a sense that is, we're talking not so much psychotherapy here. You're talking about the boundary between this life and the next, or
Well, both. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you made that point because on some level, like we think of mental boundaries, right, as means of self-preservation. Like, let's think of a mental boundary, right? They keep things out, but they also keep us in. And that can sometimes be the danger of boundaries. And so we see that sometimes people navigate their lives very rigidly, not really letting much out, not letting much in. And those people are the ones that tend to come through with more realizations on the other side of, oh, I realize now I felt like this. And whereas people who were kind of airy-fairy or more open, less boundary-oriented, just seem to come through more with that awareness.
this is great to hear because I don't really have any boundaries.
And boundaries are good, but from an angle of being able to bypass them and step through thresholds, there's something about threshold states that relates to the afterlife.
There's this metaphor that comes up in the Baha'i faith, but maybe in other places too, using the baby in the womb as a metaphor for like us in this physical reality right now versus like what might happen after we die. And I saw this video recently of a baby that was born still in its amniotic sac. And I was just like struck by it because it looked so confined. And I think I've been pregnant recently, and I just imagined my baby kind of like floating in this space. I didn't realize how confined that soul or that baby is in the world of the womb. It made me think about how potentially confined we are in this world compared to whatever happens after. I just wonder what you think about that comparison of like limitations in this world compared to like limitlessness maybe that we might feel in the next.
Totally. And that kind of concept of graduation.
Yeah.
And I would find that when we talk about that, it's so interesting because there are parallels between the death process and the birth process. I find that concept very interesting. We talk about life reviews.
Can I just say, there's one little thing that I think you might love. If somebody is born in the sort of traditionally kind of healthiest, safest way, which is head first, that's like kind of ideal. That's what, happens all kinds of other ways. I was too much premature, kicked my way out, nearly died. It's all good. But I'm just saying it is the best way to come out for everybody. The first and only voluntary act the person must perform as it begins to understand that it is leaving the womb, it must bow its head. And then it goes under the under the bone and leaves. I just thought isn't that crazy? So you said parallels between death and life. It's like between birth and death. Like when I found that out, it was from a midwife, and my wife is a doula, and I know so many midwives, and I literally stopped her and I was like, "Wait a second, are you telling me?" And she was like, yeah. And I was like, how am I 33 years old? And this is the first time I'm hearing about this. Like, that's a profound act. You have to bow your head to enter this realm.
There are plenty of
That is amazing.
Plenty of men who do not know how that department works from a lady.
Sure.
So you're not the only one.
I was like, so you have a, is it a tube?
No. Yes. Well, I will say that's such a keen observation because when it comes to the afterlife and even the symbology, oftentimes people will see a tunnel. They sometimes will see a bridge. Generally, the symbology of what people see just in cultural studies done by Dr. Raymond Moody on near-death experiences, he noticed that every symbol that people saw, whether it was a door, a bridge, these all kind of symbolize being in progress or going into something, much like how one leaves the birth canal. So there is that idea of like, there's the light and we're leaving, and a natural process kind of happens. And it's why I'm inclined to not so much talk even about like earthbound spirits or the traditional idea of ghosts, because I truly believe that much like the birth process kind of has mechanisms, and sure, things can go wrong in the birth process. There's something about nature always finding a way to move forward. So I don't tend to really interact with things that seem stuck here. It seems that whether we like it or not, we keep moving forward.
Tyler, you were going to say something about the life review. And then what were you going to say?
Yeah, that aspect is so interesting because you find it even in studies around hospice and within the nursing community that people towards the end of life, time and time again, very often seem to go into deeper states of introspection. People who avoided contacting their family members for decades very often will start getting feelings that they didn't have before, inclinations to pick up the phone, almost an urge to resolve something that perhaps in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s they didn't even care about. And I don't think that's on accident. I think that there, for most of us, is a natural impulse to finish up unfinished business, to tie up the loose ends, to be able to kind of prepare for this next state. And we're all working on different degrees of introspection. So I think if we can do the work while we're healthy, while we're alive, while we can make a difference, then we kind of miss out on future regret, which is great.
Yeah, I really feel for anybody around me when I'm dying because I already am pretty introspective. So I don't really know. I don't really know what's going to happen there.
You're just going to go, you're just going to disappear into a being of light.
Tyler, he died a bunch of times when he was a baby. Like they kept having to revive him. So
yeah,
so
actually,
I
for the
often
first
feel
year,
that
just
Penn is already
constantly
like
dying.
halfway in the other realm. Yeah.
Just one foot in, one
it's
foot
actually
out.
true.
Yeah.
The first,
Not fully here.
multiple times a day, I would flatline, and my mom had to revive me for the first 12 months.
That is what. Do you attribute any of those kind of transdimensional experiences to your creativity, or do you not feel that related?
Here's how I honestly feel about life. I don't have feelings or opinions so much. I'm just here. No, I have feelings. I'm not sure how to express them, but I'm like, I'm just like, I'm here and I'll go sometime. Yes, creativity, I think, is the only thing I've ever... It's seemingly the only thing that ever seemed logical for me to do, to be honest. I don't know if that answers your question, and I don't want to make this about me, but yeah.
Well, I love it. Thank you. That's very cool.
I was curious to know a little bit about your transition into being a public-facing medium. You said you had your first show at 19. Is it true that you did an episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians the year before, so you were 18?
I did, yes. I was on.
How did that happen? And then I also want to know, once you became famous, like how has that impacted your life? And
Yeah. Well, my life is felt dictated by meaningful coincidences. And I grew up in a very small town, Hanford, California. Yeah, and a lot of agriculture, not a lot of celebrities. And coincidentally, I ended up meeting Kara Kardashian, who lives in Fresno at the time, which was about 45 minutes from my small little town. And she'd heard about me through the grapevine of just doing readings, word of mouth, and appeared one day and asked for a reading and had a great experience. And then she told her cousins. And it just kind of all happened serendipitously. She made a call. They were like, oh, well, we'd like a reading ourselves. And then wham, bam, it all kind of fell into place. But it was very unusual, very abnormal for me, as where I came from was so not about pop culture. I mean, the people I was around were farmers, blue collar workers, salt of the earth people, but people who honestly, a lot of them didn't even have TVs. So it was a completely different world. And in many ways, I feel like I was naive. I still feel like I'm a little naive in some ways, but I actually view that as a strength because, I think in some ways, I always want to be an optimist. I always want to see the good in people and hope that people are capable of better.
So how did becoming famous change your life?
Becoming more well-known really changed my life in every way, and I'm so humbled by it and so shocked every single day that I get to wake up and live this life, especially considering where I came from and the fact that I graduated high school at 16 with the goal of trying to become a hospice nurse. So, I was the youngest person in my class, and I thought that was going to be the path I would do, while perhaps sharing messages for people who were dying and perhaps their families on a much more private level. But I ended up reading the dean of my college, again, insane coincidences, and he encouraged me to kind of consider doing what I did for him, for other people. So it's really insane to say. I mean, it's like a movie; it writes itself. But so it's why I love reading biographies, and I'm sure you guys can look back at it in your own lives, because there's these pivotal moments in all of our lives of destiny, and being able to recognize it and jump on the chance when it's right in front of you is the value of intuition.
Hmm. Yeah. Tyler, it seems like doing readings takes a physical toll on you. How do you take care of yourself as you do this work?
I have a lot of kind of turning on and turning off, and a lot, ironically, of boundary making within my process. So, while doing what I do requires kind of the transcendence of boundaries, when I'm not working, I do try to kind of set up some mental walls to be able to bifurcate kind of this typical flow stage, which is very anti-structural, into something that is more structural so that I can maintain routines and rituals. So when I'm not working, right after a reading, will listen to music really loud. Sometimes I'll move around, I'll dance like a crazy person, I'll do anything physical to just kind of shake off the energy. I sat with Caesar Milan one time, and he, of course, is the expert in dogs. And he told me a very keen observation. He said, if you've ever seen a dog injure itself, what do they do right after? He said, they shake it off. They shake it off. And we don't shake it off as human beings. So very often we kind of accrue this trauma and anxiety in our bodies without kind of being able to let it go as nature intends. And so keeping that in mind, I've implemented in my process and allow it to kind of help cleanse things.
So you're talking just now about your experiences sort of in this flow state between this world and another for work. But I'm curious, do you ever use that intuition that you have or that connection that you can access for your own life, like to make your own decisions or anything like that?
Absolutely. There is something to be said about bias and the difficulty that provides. I like reading strangers because I don't have a horse in the race. I can just relay and be the interpreter. When it comes to myself, I don't do readings for myself unless I'm in big trouble. Generally just because, I'm so invested. I have my own hopes, fears, and biases, and that makes it very difficult to kind of connect on an intuitive level. So there have been life or death situations where things come through, but generally it's more focused on others. However, I do a lot of paranormal experiments when I'm not working, to try to kind of tinker and see how I can push my ability to its limits and perhaps facilitate stronger connections.
Do you have any fear related to death or mortality or just your, I don't know.
I think there's something that motivates me to not cross the street without looking. I think there's some instinctual urge that encourages us to sustain life and continue and stay here to the best of our ability. When I think of fear, I honestly fear human depravity. I fear what we see on the news. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of my fear is. I don't view the other side as anything worth being afraid of or reminded of the evils of living people all the time and how we have to deal with that.
Tyler, I saw you on a podcast recently where you talked about sort of medium being under the umbrella of clairvoyance, and some people can see the future. Do you have any clairvoyance for the future? And if you do you have hope for humanity? Like, see bright spots in the future?
I do have hope. Again, being that I am an optimist, I might not be the best source there, but I will say my kind of specificity on events generally revolves around one-on-one interactions. So I, for some reason, have a harder time being able to kind of get an understanding, like Nostradamus did, of like worldwide events. I'm usually better with like reading one-on-one people. So for whatever reason, it just seems to be kind of the way information comes in. But I always think that we can learn from our mistakes. I think society moving forward, so long as it does not forget its history, we can continue to move forward, even if that's 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, 5 steps forward. It's a back and forth. But I think it all is serving kind of a greater process of individuation.
Do you have kind of along the lines of what Sophie was asking before, like, do you have a kind of a private spiritual practice? Like, I'm thinking for myself, sometimes my work can feel, not always, because it's actually a gift. It can be a very spiritual occupation to act and to create things, and sometimes it can be really, really mundane. And we're in a culture and an environment that doesn't really include conversations about this stuff too much. So sometimes life can feel like necessary compartmentalization of this stuff, so that it's like privately, private's not the right way to put it, but it's like I immerse myself in it, and in other ways consciously I read writings, I meditate, I pray, I engage in conversations with other people, trying to ignite this kind of excitement for this dimension of life. I'm wondering, because this is sort of, do you have like an on or off switch? Do you do things privately where you're like really immersing yourself in it and like cultivating this kit, or something along those lines?
Totally. I mean, I'll put it this way. I think what's so valuable about intuition and intuitive processes is that they help us access our genius. So I'm a big fan of musician and philosopher Genesis P. Orridge. And they, as they were non-binary, kind of had a whole belief that everybody was here to be more of themselves, to create. And that perhaps even our sole purpose might be to kind of short circuit control through our creations and through being more of ourselves, and to going with our interests, as they often are indications of our calling. And so, as I navigate my own life, I try to kind of view creativity as interlinked in that way, and that we all have access to a greater genius inside. But we can only really get in touch with that through being able to know when to start and when to stop. And that's intuitive, and that's also creative, ranging from, a brush stroke to where you start or stop a song in its creation. So there's something about that.
Tyler, we had an expert on happiness on the show last season, and we asked her the question, what do we get wrong about happiness? And I want to ask you the question, from your experiences, what do we get wrong about the purpose of life?
I think we get wrong about the purpose of life, that there's a singular purpose. That's what I would say. I think it's more about finding purpose in every moment, being purposeful, living a purpose-filled life. There's an adage in the medium world that I like, and it's really, the magic is in the meaning. So leaving a meaningful legacy and leading a meaningful life. That, for me, is how we get the most out of our purpose. Purposes. Plural.
If you could go back to your 12-year-old self, what would you say or do, if anything?
If I could go back to my 12-year-old self, I would say, be even weirder than you are, because the very thing that's getting you beaten up and isolated is the very thing that's going to get you famous and Emmy nominated, baby, and living in Malibu and changing lives. So that's what I would say.
He's jumping out right at the end. Let's talk to that man for 45 minutes.
That's right.
That's amazing. That's amazing. You can catch Live from the Other Side with Tyler Henry on Netflix, and you can keep up with him online at Tyler Henry Medium.
We are so excited that you can now listen to Podcrushed ad-free on Amazon Music. In fact, you can listen to any episode of Podcrushed ad-free right now on Amazon Music with an Amazon Prime membership.
I'm gonna do this wavy arm thing that only people on YouTube can see. But then, if you're listening, just imagine that I'm not only waving my arms, but I'm like bending my torso in this way that's like kind of.
He looks like those floaty things outside of like car shops.
Yeah,
okay.
totally.
I was going for see an enemy, but that's less graceful. Okay, I hear you.